Indie rock. It's easily one of the, if not the single most influential genre in popular music within the last few years. Arguably ever. When I mention indie rock, a lot of bands might come to mind: Sonic Youth, Radiohead, Boy Genius, and like those bands, indie rock can vary a lot sonically and even aesthetically. That's even ignoring the major spin-offs of indie rock, the derivative subgenres such as popular emo and stomp clap hey, which begs a decent question. If indie rock is somehow one step between Mumford & Sons and Cap'n Jazz, what the hell is indie rock? Why did anyone make it? And how do we group these bands together, especially as the genre continues to evolve? For the sake of time in this video, I'm going to focus on a specific type of indie rock. While decent arguments of what is and isn't indie rock can and have been made by musicologists, linguists, and even sociologists, some going from indie rock is just a single musical movement that started in the 80s in the UK and hasn't gone much further, to every single piece of popular music post-2004 is in some way indie rock. We're going to try to take a very good middle ground at describing what indie rock is, while also avoiding music that might be better described by one of its derivative subgenres like indie folk, math rock, or even Riot Grrrl. Yeah, some people actually describe Riot Grrrl, the punk subgenre that sounds like punk, as indie rock, which is weird. But how is it possible? It's simple, because indie rock is seldomly described by its actual sound. So in this video, I'll be talking a lot about the indie aesthetic. And while I assume if you're clicking on a video about indie rock, you could assume what I mean by indie aesthetic, but I'm going to give you a brief definition of what the indie aesthetic is, starting off with what is indie. So indie means independent, but notably not in the way that we usually use it now. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a band that is on an independent label or even independent from a label. Usually when you say a band is indie, it usually means they're self-releasing their music, but that's not really what this term means, for two reasons. One, yeah, the term indie, meaning not on a label, does actually come from the same UK scene in the 70s when the Buzzcocks released an EP independently, and they would call it r.e.m. And they subsequently coined the term indie. But by the 90s, bands like r.e.m. were signed by major labels and releasing music while being the poster children of indie rock in the United States. So they're independent from something, but it isn't necessarily independent from record labels. Rather, they're independent from the expectation of what rock and roll is and the expectation of what these rock groups might do. Notably, the idea of like an indie band not being on a label at all really isn't going to be popularized until the early aughts, when MySpace really blows up the music scene, where anyone with an internet connection could easily promote their music. But still, it wasn't until iTunes actually gained popularity that indie started to really mean something, because you could actually display your music among that with the actual big names of the time. And it really wasn't until Spotify that indie bands started to really actually have a way of breaking out. Indie as in independent from a record label. The other confusion actually comes from independent game studios, which might be called indie games, because independent studios are independent completely from the major structure. Usually, I've actually seen some people say that games have indie aesthetics despite having major corporate backing. Regardless, if I'm saying indie in this video, no, I'm not talking about a band that isn't signed to a label or is even signed to an indie label. They can be, they might not be, it doesn't matter. We're talking about indie aesthetics, which, if we know what indie is, what is an aesthetic? Well, Tumblr uses the term aesthetic, and most social media has now coined it in a very visually pleasing way. And I think that that is a good way of understanding aesthetics, especially when it comes to visual art. But with art, it really just raises a couple of questions. The questions I like to ask when thinking about musical aesthetics are the following. 1, what is the goal of the music? Especially, what are the goal of the lyrics? 2, who is creating the music? Who is singing the lyrics, both literally and in a narrative? 3, what is the intended method of delivery? And related, what is the intended method of creation? Where is this music being made? Where is it being performed? And on what is it being performed? With indie rock, the purpose is almost always self-reflexive. The music is working on itself. The singer is singing about themselves. The singer might be singing about how Jenny broke up with him, but in reality, it's not singing about Jenny, but rather how he feels. That is to say that the lyrics are almost always emotional, but they aren't going to be focusing on interactions or even the beliefs or actions of others, but one's own emotions, opinions, or beliefs. Who is creating the music is very important, as the identity of the music is kind of imbued in the person, and the person obviously imbues their identity in the music that they create. It sort of creates this cycle where a person describes themselves by their music, and the music describes the person. So as the genre continues to develop as a cultural identity, we can see this difference between indie grow different from the mainstream, and that is notable, especially as the genre is now 40 to 50 years old. With the identity of the individual being morphed and simultaneously infused with the identity of the genre, what's left in the case of indie is a very masculine, very heterosexual, and very white identity. But conversely, it doesn't base its identity off of sexuality like other rock music, especially of the 70s and 80s. It creates, ironically, a very pure culture that is more likely to sing about your partner getting up and leaving than you and your partner getting down. And I say your partner, but in reality, I should probably just say his girlfriend, because most of the time when we're talking about indie rock, the method of delivery is from that of a man. Indie rock generally, especially in its early days, was almost always focused on masculine narratives. And even when a narrative might not be focused around a man, even being sung or being interpreted by a woman, it usually is using that as a pseudo-masculine narrative to frame it in a different light. We'll explain this more in depth later, but let's define the last two primary modes of the aesthetic before I dive deep into the weeds there. So as I mentioned, we're going to group those last two together, with the method of creation and the method of delivery. What really matters is that it has to subvert cultural expectations in just about every way it can get away with doing. And the method can be political or apolitical. Frequently, actually, it's not political, it's completely apolitical, and it challenges rather small ideas of a certain group of people, like the rock and roll music scene of the 1970s, rather than something at large. That's one of the big differences between proto-post-punk and proto-indie, is the fact that post-punk will almost always be singing about a politically charged topic, while indie's usually, not always, but usually going to be singing about oneself and not comparing that to something larger. Though post-punk and indie have diverted on their courses, there are a couple of subgenres that are interesting children of divorce, like emo and Riot Girl, which might better be described one than the other than they're actually typically grouped with, but are actually more frequently lumped in with the other one because of aesthetic reasons rather than the music's actual sound. I think emo is really interesting in that case, as it's frequently put in with indie rock while it might have more relation to contemporary post-punk. These three ideas are what I personally perceive as the three primary pillars of indie rock. While indie subgenres push beyond these expectations and might add more nuances, if we're just talking about indie rock, these will always be present. And while other genres might add these ideas and might even play on them, if you see these three things, and they're notably the most clear things about the song, it might be best to describe this as indie rock, regardless of how the music sounds. And just one more time, the characteristics are a separation from what is considered good musically and socially, a reflexive nature in the lyrics, or lack thereof, a focus on a homosocial, non-sexual, even at times asexual masculine identity, and a method of social commentary that subverts typical political discourse. Anything can be indie rock if it has these, and if it doesn't have even one of these, it probably isn't indie rock. Earlier, I mentioned that punk is indie rock's genre cousin, but later I also described proto-indie rock and proto-post-punk coming up at the same time, which how could something's cousin be coming up at the same time as its child, except for reality? I mean more in a cultural genealogy kind of way, not literal, I understand time. So outside of the fact that calling indie and punk cousins would make grindcore and stomp clap hey second cousins, or third cousins, depending on if deathcore is grindcore's. Someone will tell me. How these are all connected, as I mentioned, is post-punk, which is a stupidly broad genre that actually just spawned off an even broader genre, being indie rock. This spin-off happened somewhere between the 70s and the 80s, and it's not to be confused with the post-rock movement of the 90s, which is weirdly actually a subgenre of indie rock, a lot of people argue, which means post-punk made indie rock, which made post-rock. That's something. But post-punk as a genre isn't easily described either, and to avoid making an entire other video on just what is post-punk, I'm going to describe it kind of broadly while brushing over some of the nuances of what the genre could offer. So I'll say that post-punk is kind of rock to punk's rock and roll. It's a more musically refined version of the genre that focuses on social commentary through academic and political discourse, rather than being the raw, pure emotion. In fact, post-punk is based on the name post-punk is based on John Savage's new music, with a K, a testament to the fact that the genre was inherently infused with a Western intellectual identity. I don't want to say that that's necessarily negative or positive, but I promise we'll further this as we go on. And again, if they came up at the same time, how can they be cousins if it's closer related to its parent? For the sake of our conversation, we'll just say that contemporary punk has a lot more to do with 70s post-punk than it does with 70s punk, or even 60s punk. In fact, even less to do with 60s punk. As punk has evolved, it's replaced and infused its identity with post-punk, to the point where the sound and the aesthetics of punk are much more post-punk than punk, and I'll explain that right now. So, if that's the case, why don't we just call post-punk punk? Because post-punk remains to have a bit of a different political and cultural identity than post-punk. Post-punk usually focuses, as we mentioned, on a more academic idea. Usually, post-punk is going to be focused on radical, usually left-wing ideology, while punk is going to more be anarchist, burn it all to the ground, don't build it back. Again, this is a broad statement, and I'll even explain one of the nuances just to show how much we're glossing over while discussing indie rock. For example, skinhead punks exist, or second wave skinheads, which originally were a movement of the UK punks derived from the mod and hooligan movements, such a serious country, who all shaved their heads and generally just fucked around football matches and got into fights. Kind of just kids who were pissed off about the state of the economy and political system in the UK. They also were derived from Jamaican immigrants in the UK, which of course adds another layer to what would eventually happen to the movement. You're likely already thinking it, because when I said skinhead, you probably went, ooh, because skinheads, especially in the US, are incredibly tied to neo-Nazi movements. Now that's not to say all skinheads are neo-Nazis, but that is to say that most of the time, these radical post-punks, when it came to the post-punk movement, skinheads shifted radically right. And saying that all post-punks are leftists, or that all post-punks are going to be more political than their punk counterparts, is a generalization, which generally is true, and when we're talking about it in relation to indie, we'll be fine. But if you want to talk about post-punk as a genre completely, I'd have to make a whole other video on that. All that is to say, post-punk then more closely resembles punk now, at least musically. So if we're going to talk about genre genealogy, I'm going to put post-punk and indie as cousins, both coming from contemporary punk, rather than post-punk is now punk, which indie rock. It would be confusing. That is also not to say that indie rock or post-punk is made by intellectual geniuses. I think rather it actually highlights more about the specific cultural value that makes it so we take something more serious about post-punk and indie than we do about punk, and we take something more serious about rock than we do about rock and roll. With rock and roll, it's a lot more obvious because rock was a predominantly white version of the rock and roll subgenre with a higher education. I wonder why people who were more educated took it seriously and wrote more about it. With indie and post-punk, there's definitely something similar at play here, to the point where I can name a good number of punk bands going all the way back to the 70s with bands like Death that actually were comprised of people of color, while a lot of indie bands I can't. And that's to point out the fact that punk has been more inclusive of women and queer people within their spaces, while indie rock continues to be dominated almost exclusively by white straight men, occasionally by white straight women. So tracing indie rock's genealogy will give us an important insight into what indie rock is and what it was historically. But I can't go back too far, so I'm going to stop here. The big things that we need to get are that indie rock is perceived better than punk for some reason in academic discourse, but still indie rock isn't perceived as high art in the way like Mozart or even John Coltrane might be. When reading discussions about the pretty big racial divide in the genre online, I see a lot of people throw around a haphazard argument that I do want to address, which is that jazz artists are seen as high art and are often studied by academia. But I do want to give you an open invitation to look at your local university, go to the School of Music staff directory and look at the jazz department if they have one, One, they might not have one, even if it's a relatively large school. And two, if it is, how many people of color are actually in it, and how many women? It's still gonna be mostly white men. And if it isn't, that genuinely does make me very happy. That being said, I did that with a number of universities in my area and was greatly disappointed. So yeah, academia is still going to be predominantly white, and even if it comes from a different cultural background, that doesn't necessarily disregard the fact that it's still going to prioritize things that are culturally liked.
Editor Nick here. I just wanted to add some context because I fear I just hit you guys with like a crazy non sequitur. What's really important is that we're noting that people think art or culture is more important if it's studied rather than noting that it is studied. So the thing is, we should ask, why is something being studied? And my point is that this is studied, and that doesn't necessarily make it more valuable culturally, and not that it should or shouldn't be studied. Okay, back to the video.
At the end of the day, indie isn't highbrow art. It's popular music that is inspired by intellectual discourse and not necessarily contributing to intellectual discourse directly. While academic types publishing on and analyzing the genre puts it more in the academic sphere, it's important to differentiate the difference between the art actually contributing to academics and rather just influencing some sort of discourse. Indie is also important in traditional academia because it is primarily white men. Academia, primarily white men. Both are going to be focused on Western white ideology, and it's going to reinforce the beliefs and the preconceived notions of the intellectual types who are already publishing on music. That's why you can find so much about indie rock's lyrics by linguists and sociologists and even psychologists. There's so many. I even am going to link some of the papers that I read while making this video down below if you ever want to read more about the genre. So yeah, the genre does do things that are broadly positive, but it does also reinforce oppressive nature of Eurocentric, heteronormative, patriarchal values in British and American society, which influence the themes even more so when the people who are doing it are mostly heterosexual white men. Indie is influenced by academia. Many indie artists are well-read and generally come from higher socioeconomic standings from their punk contemporaries, but that does not make their creation highbrow art. Rather, it highlights why the high arts don't take indie rock's pure genres nearly as seriously as they do indie. Indie's like the high lowbrow art, and academics can make an exception if that means strengthening the general ideas of popular academia. Moving forward, what will be most important to understand about indie rock's origin is that it comes from the 80s in the UK, from the post-punk scene, started by the soft intellectual types quoting Keats and Yeats because they're on your side. By the time it reaches the States, though, it's very popular. Unlike punk, the scene is very monolithic with generally well-educated, middle-class, young white men, usually heterosexual. The genre explodes in the 90s with songs like Everybody Hurts and Losing My Religion. It hits its peak in the aughts with Mr. Brightside and went on to heavily influence popular music across the genres. In the 2010s, indie returns in a more experimental but still very popular outsider form of music with bands like Tame Impala, Arctic Monkeys, and Car Seat Headrests. Now in the 2020s, it's been absolutely dominated by indie rock with bands like Big Thief, Geese, and Black Country New Road becoming some of the biggest names in the music scene. It's at a crossroads between truly independent from the original sense of the word and actually profitable for these massive companies which are pouring tons of money into these bands. Geese being a great example of this because when I was writing this script, their entire public image just exploded. If I do mention them and I don't talk about that in the script, it's because halfway through the script I actually had to start talking about Geese as like a kind of negative because people don't like them now because of practices that we will get to. Regardless, indie's history helps contextualize and is necessary to understand the genre as a growing and changing but still definable cultural identity. I'm accessorizing now. So as far as we've gone so far, we've defined what indie rock is and we've documented its origin. But drawing any conclusions or really understanding anything about the genre from just those would be basically conjecture. When analyzing music, even if it's analyzing an entire genre, it's important to analyze both the lyrics, the historical culture, but also the music. So let's look at actual examples of the music and see if it actually stands up to the things we've mentioned before. A little to my surprise, trying to choose one single group from the 80s to define the early days of indie rock was actually rather difficult. It was even harder to choose a single album. a song, and then when I finally did, even trying to choose an excerpt from the song is actually very hard. We could go all the way back to 1977 with Spiral Scratch by the Buzzcocks, which is the first independently released album of all time. Quite interestingly, fundraised by friends and family to print it onto vinyl, and they sold it out, and they've been making music for a long time. I don't know if they're actually still active. Editor Nick will tell you. So yes, if you Google what is the first major indie rock album, you're gonna get Spiral Scratch by the Buzzcocks. But we're not gonna talk about Spiral Scratch by the Buzzcocks. Instead, I'm gonna talk about arguably one of the most important hits in indie rock ever. And arguably it's indie pop, but I think this is before there's enough of a differentiation between the two. So if anything, it's proto-indie pop. It's definitely rock music in my opinion. It is There Is a Light That Never Goes Out by the Smiths. Specifically, we're going to talk about this verse right here.
In the darkened underpass, I thought, oh God, my chance has come at last. But then a strange fear gripped me and I just couldn't ask.
The Smiths are like the quintessential indie boy before there was an indie boy. And now indie boy has even more connotations than when the term was coined. See Kate Words there. Indie boy aesthetics are in full force here. The yearning, almost ironic sexual purity of a guy he's too shy. His situation is just painful and confusing. The aesthetic of the night, which also importantly plays into a lot of queer imagery, which is interesting because Morrissey is actually openly a queer man. Well, we could talk about queer temporality and how queer spaces generally don't function in the same way that heterosexual spaces do, because queer people don't generally base their lives around the standard milestones of marriage, children, etc., etc. It is also worth noting that most of the Smiths songs are overtly heterosexual and usually are a male narrator talking about a female love interest with no ambiguity at all. Now, there are some cases where the ambiguity is notable, like this song right here. We don't know if this is a male singer singing about a male person. This could be a male singer singing about a male friend, lover, or even a female singer singing about a male lover. It could be heterosexual, it could not be. And that's actually odd for the genre, even at the time. And notably, when you leave behind these defined binaries, you actually are kind of left with something very sad, something that the song kind of captures perfectly, without those milestones that I mentioned earlier, and without the fact that we know if this is a heterosexual relationship. It's almost like this relationship is just boiled down to birth and death, the cemetery gates. This song is literally boiling everything down. This song might be a very interesting way to approach Jack Halberstam's queer temporality, but that would be a complete tangent that I cannot go down in a video essay about India. And that's all great. I think it's an interesting idea, and maybe one of the reasons why the Smiths have and continue to resonate so much with a queer audience. But that's not to say that it's the perfect representation or even perfect analogy of a queer experience. A single cisgender white dude from the UK who is now absurdly rich being your quintessential queer narrative is reductive at the very best. While queer imagery and queer people exist in the scene from its inception, it's clear that they do have to fit queer narratives into a heterosexual lens, or at least a way that it can be perceived heterosexually. Because as I mentioned, this was well received with a queer community, so even if it is queer music written by a queer man, it has to fit into a certain cisgender heterosexual patriarchal view, and it cannot challenge it, even indirectly. It has to be ambiguous at the very best. The 90s argue... Sorry, there's someone talking outside my door, so I got thrown off my game. But in the 90s, indie really hits its stride. Arguably, it actually hits its peak in the 90s, not commercially, but maybe artistically, because that's much more subjective. But if we're gonna choose a single song, I think I have to choose one from one of the biggest heavy hitters, if not the biggest in the United States, r.e.m, and their mega hit, Losing My Religion.
That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight, losing my religion, trying to keep up with you, and I don't know if I can do it. Oh no, I've said too much. I
it's not the band's single breakout hit, it has left, in my opinion, the biggest cultural and social impact in the American musical canon. The song contains very broad and metaphorical lyrics that are often misconstrued, but the song contains very broad and metaphorical lyrics that are often misunderstood as a literal questioning of one's religion. While it has some narrative, the lyrics primarily do focus on a dialogue with the listener until it hits the chorus, which you know. The narrator suddenly brings us into a specific moment in time. Leaving the abstract, we're introduced to the key themes of the song and some of the key motifs of indie rock from the 90s onwards. It's very self-reflexive, undeniably. It's in the first person. That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight. What am I doing? I'm losing my religion. Notably, losing my religion, while culturally pretty surprising to say, does not mean losing my religion literally. It's a term from the South that really means I'm getting very angry or I'm losing my cool. And I actually didn't know that until this. I thought he was genuinely losing Jesus because his relationship was failing. Been there, buddy.
My first girlfriend turned into the moon. That's rough, buddy.
Nonetheless, the term losing my religion is an outward challenge towards Protestant-influenced contemporary American society. Losing my religion also highlights one of the most important themes, if not the single most important theme in indie rock, which is a focus on a very hyper-masculine narrative that once again isn't sexually driven. In this case, it's actually asexually driven by someone reaping the sexual reward, for lack of a better term, that is not them, and being jealous and somehow basing a masculine energy and ideal around it. Trying to keep up with you could be perceived as an expression of his sexuality, but to me it rather expresses this purity, not just challenging societal expectations, but also the genre expectations of rock stars. Losing My Religion highlights and cements indie aesthetics into a sound that is undeniably indie rock. While inspired by earlier bands like the Velvet Underground and the Byrds, r.e.m. establishes the perfect combination of these three motifs, with a similar enough contemporary sound of indie bands. These sounds come from those jangly guitars like Vox AC30s or a Black Panel Fender Reverb. Monotone or traditionally bad vocals, don't get too mad at me, I sing in an indie band. Very simple drum beats generally, all mixed together in a pop-like feel with more reverb than you've ever heard in your entire life. And indie rock, like this, continues to be popular, influencing major pop hits like Billie Eilish and Olivia Rodrigo. Inside the genre, the sound is evolving and ever-changing through musical and cultural movements. This song's lasting influence on the genre, though, is a testament to the power of those three motifs that we see in the song. Its popularity does not diminish the fact that it's indie, despite the name independent, or even being independent from popular music. Rather, its popularity is reinforced by the fact that it is so very indie. As the genre progressed, the motifs of the genre became more abstract, but notably even more prevalent. The success of bands like r.e.m. allowed major labels to invest bigger amounts and more time into bands with even more complex approaches to these motifs. Especially the one that they care the most about, in my opinion, masculinity, which in the 2000s entered a really interesting dialogue among the changing social climate of the early 2000s. Among the ways that masculinity appears in indie rock across its subgenres and generation, no narrative is as prevalent as the breakup song, or what I like to call the indie love song, which is kind of seen in r.e.m.'s Losing My Religion, but really hits its stride in the 2000s with the song we're going to analyze next, Mr. Brightside.
And I just can't look, it's killing me, and taking control. Jealousy, turning saints into the sea, swimming through sick lullabies, choking on your alibis, but it's just the price I pay. Destiny is calling me. Open up my eager eyes, 'cause I'm Mr. Brightside.
The singer and lyricist Brandon Flowers really hits the nail on the head here. He really reaches that perfect mix between pop sound and raw lyric delivery. And as I mentioned, he introduces the indie love song. In the indie love song, we get to see a male who's almost always alone, thinking about his female lover having sex with another man. Really, it is weird how many indie rock songs follow this formula. In this way, Flowers walks a perfect line of pop sensibility in the sound and experimentalism in the lyrics, while still following the constructs of indie enough to remain fashionable in the genre. A really interesting paper I read by Tasha R. Taylor discusses the approach of the Killers' lyrics and themes throughout their career in her article, Murder to Marriage, The Approach of the Killers. A negotiation of these spheres of musical masculinity that alternately upholds and challenges rigid classifications. These negotiations manifest particularly through a series of masculine vocalizers who have gradually forsaken narrative distance to become identifiable as the band's frontman himself. Mr. Brightside serves as a different and more avant-garde approach to indie lyricism, but it still moves towards that idea of masculine purity that indie is obsessed with, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. But it's also more musically similar to the post-punk that it comes from, as Flowers wasn't very inspired by contemporary indie music, which is a notable and interesting trend of the genre to constantly be self-referential rather than moving forward. Since the 2010s, indie's taken a different space culturally than it did in the 90s and 2000s, and honestly, that understanding of indie is primarily the way that I approached this video. Notably because that is the indie that I'm most familiar with and the indie that I actually started creating myself. It's subversive, but after being popular in the mainstream for the better part of 2 decades, it's pretty hard to say that by 2012, indie was an underground, independent, small punk, for lack of a better word, subgenre. With indie being in the popular musical zeitgeist for so long and being so influential in all forms of music into now very, very popular music, it's no longer unique in the same way it used to be. Between the 80s and 2010s, there was a massive shift in indie rock from experimental to fashionable. But in the public eye and in contemporary culture in general, it's kind of seen as neither. I would say most indie rock, especially from the early 2010s, isn't particularly experimental. Indie and post-punk revival moves the genre away from the more mainstream sound, but not in a new way, more back to the way it sounded in the 90s and early 2000s. One of the bands that most encapsulates this idea is a band that actually started in the early 2000s but didn't really find massive appeal until much later, being The Strokes, who sound more like a 90s grunge band or an early 2000s indie band than they do whatever they're doing now. The idea of cool is subjective, but the aptly named indie boys aren't cool, they're outcasts. Sometimes with a K. Get it, like the new music joke I made earlier. It's a callback. The bad boy persona, which was popularized by the YA novels of the late 2000s and early 2010s, whole other video, clearly influenced the public idea of the indie boy. Originally, the image of the indie boy as a recreation of the bad boy archetype that we got in fanfiction characterization media is actually contradictory to the traditional indie aesthetics we talked about before. But over time, it shifted from the soft boy idea. Notably, there is a rise. What the heck was that? Notably, this is a rise in fandom culture. There was a big shift from a number of the major players in the music scene at the time, like Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco, from being indie or emo bands to suddenly being pop bands fronted by a good-looking dude, and bands like 21 Pilots burst onto the scene, and by the late 2010s, fan fiction and things like those actually started influencing the view of the indie boy, usually through that bad boy idea that was popularized by that late 2000s, early 2010s YA novel. That's a whole other video, but the bad boy and the soft boy, or the bad boy and the indie boy, aren't in direct contrast. In fact, usually, especially in the early days of fanfiction of these types, or even fanfiction of other musical genres like One Direction, they'd be described as punk or even indie. But they would usually be that bad boy archetype, which interestingly would contradict the typical indie aesthetics that we described before. Now, this could have been a greater cultural shift away from the indie boy idea, but I don't think it was, because over time we slowly saw it shift back with the creation of the soft boy aesthetic, which is only aided by the fact that soft boys are now seen as a negative thing. The soft boy aesthetic is, interestingly and usually rightfully, panned for being quite pandery. That's very alliterative of me. But bad boy and soft boy, despite seeming like opposites, are far from mutually exclusive. Especially now as the soft boy is seen as a facade or some sort of nefarious purposes, mostly because a damaged individual who completely relies on another individual and is so soft and good intention is usually a manipulation tactic and not a genuine character trait, but I digress. That bad boy and soft boy architect weirdly works very well in indie. Despite being rather manipulative in practice, bands like Car Seat Headrest do it quite well. Of all the bands from this era, though, one that best represents 2010's culture is, again, arguably not perfectly fit into indie rock by everyone's definitions, but by the functioning definition that we've described here, I think it's Tame Impala. While Tame Impala does sound very different, it's worth noting that he does use a lot of old gear, which I think adds a lot to the indie aesthetic of his music. I say aesthetic to mean visual, but also sound that sounds like music that could have been made 10, 20 years ago. So the genre will find itself entrenched inherently in the aesthetics of its predecessors, and I think that will make it more influential on indie rock as time goes on. Here's a clip from one of their songs. If the gender ambiguity of the Smiths was highlighting the queer spaces within the indie scene, then Tame Impala highlights the catapulting of the genre out of queer spaces, out of the queer time of the night and into the daylight, as the genre made a strong shift towards more heteronormative expectations than it was at its inception. And that's not that heterosexual points of view are bad. I quite like the song. It's also not that queer people don't enjoy Tame Impala. Trust me, they do. But it does mean that the genre's connection to the mainstream culture really strengthened the aesthetics and the expectations that they would be the driving forces behind the music. The entire conceit of this song is very similar to Mr. Brightside. The male character is very upset that his female love interest wants to have sex with another male, Trevor, and he's very sad about it because he has much more pure intentions. Whatever. Okay. It's the same as Mr. Brightside lyrically. It's the exact same narratively. The exact same. There's other songs that do this, as I mentioned. It's the indie love song. But regardless, the idea of masculine purity is contrasted by the opposite character, the non-indie boy, the sex-driven alpha male, who is, in this case, a bad thing. The growing idea of the cool guy changed because of the YA boom, and a shift in the scene towards a younger, more woman-driven scene meant that fandom cultures became more intrinsic to the indie scene. Tame Impala is not political, and it's not subversive when we look at it in the context of the music that comes before it. But when you think about it, it is a guy singing about his ex having sex with her new partner, which by popular standards is relatively subversive. These ideas and this contrasting of hypersexuality in men makes sense why indie has had such a boom in these last few years, especially with people like Nick Fuentes, Andrew Tate, etc. The idea of the alpha male, clavicular, oh my god, what is happening on the internet? What is happening to men? Well, I'm not like other men. Makes sense. It makes sense why men will resonate more with this, but it also makes sense why people who are a fan of those particular incel influenced ideologies, we'll say, might be attracted to the idea of Mr. Brightside, or might be attracted to the idea of Tame Impala. There is a certain connection between those two ideas that challenges the hypersexuality of the perfect man persona. And as I admitted, it might not be indie rock in the way that it doesn't sound like most indie rock. But aesthetically, it fits very, very well, and I think when we look in the next 10 years, in the next 15, 20, maybe even more, we'll associate it more with indie rock than we did at its release. Because I know now, 11 years after its release, we're associating Tame Impala and all of his work more with indie rock than anyone ever did when it came out. And I think its influence on bands like Geese and other groups that are really popular right now will have a lasting impact on indie as a genre that it will at least be worth analyzing his work within this video, I hope. Or I will have crazy egg on my face in 10 years. The indie discourse will run deep. The 2020s are young. No, they're not. They're really not. We are over halfway through this decade as I'm recording this, and it's hard to measure cultural significance, as I basically just went on that tangent, because it's hard to even say if in 10 years Tame Impala will be considered indie rock in the way that I've seen a lot of people call Tame Impala indie rock somewhat recently. So trying to choose a single band from our current decade that stands out as this is the indie band is really difficult, but because we're over halfway through the decade, I do think it would be worth to take a swing at getting the most influential indie band of this decade out right now. Like I mentioned before, as I was in the process of writing the script, the band Geese got absolutely fucking trashed by the internet. They got revealed to be doing some really shady advertising techniques, including using bots and doing things that, if we're going to talk about being indie as an independent from the expectations of the general corporate music world, they're not indie. But regardless of if they're truly indie from the traditional societal expectations of music, they are very popular. And if we analyze their music and allow ourselves to look at it broadly, we might get a more interesting claim than just going, posers because you did something I don't like. Though they did do something I don't like. It's very weird. I only know like 2 people who like Geese in real life. 3 if you include myself. I thought the album was pretty good, if I'm being real. I like Getting Killed. Oh, that's a weird thing to say. Anyway, here's a clip from their Artificial Breakout album, Getting Killed.
I told poor John, you've been talking to you know who. And if you can talk to him, you can talk to me too. And Joan of Arc, she warned, the Lord has a lot of friends, and in the end, he'll probably forget he's met you before. Oh, Charles, tell me about the end. You were there the day the music died, and I'll be there the day it dies again.
The lyrics really loosely do follow like that 90s indie movement rather than the more mainstream stuff from the previous 2 decades, which would make sense that more revival stuff is very popular right now, and it was very popular a decade ago. That being said, the general theme of the song does feel a lot like that of Tame Impala. It's very standard in heteronormativity and popular gender roles. Its subversion very much follows the expectations of the genre we've worked out here. It isn't like the lyrics are bad, but it does sound a lot like Losing My Religion was written by The Killers. The soft boy aesthetic is there, and I don't want to turn this into a personal attack. The songs are good. The lyrics aren't my thing, but musically, this is very, very interesting. Musically, there is a reason why Geese's record label had to fake engagement, bot views, comments, and all that crazy shit. Their music isn't really sparking that much discussion, at least from the perspective of the record label. If the 2010s saw people beginning to think of indie as intellectual, Geese is Seinfeld of indie, or if you don't get what I mean by that, it's fucking Rick and Morty of indie. If you don't have an IQ above 150, you don't understand you know that joke. Look, some people get it. They'll post videos about it, ignore that some of those people aren't real and they're bots. But if you don't get it, it's probably because you're too dumb to get the intellectualism of a band like Geese. Again, I don't think the music is bad. I really like Getting Killed. I said it again, but it's a good album. It's worth noting, once again, that the genius... It is worth noting, though, that the genius white male songwriter is a little overly prevalent in the genre and is painfully prevalent with Geese's music, but we won't go there. The intellectualism hasn't really changed since the genre really took off in the 90s. The intellectualism hasn't really changed since the genre hit its... The intellectualism and the intellectual approach of the really smart songwriter who makes the perfect music hasn't really changed, at least in the last 15-ish years. And it's kind of posed in a way that if you don't like it, then you don't get it. I like it, but I also don't get it. So at the end of the day, does indie rock's lyrics and music stay consistent? Music? No, I actually think indie is one of the most interesting genres for that reason. As we saw, indie can sound like The Smiths, or indie can sound like Tame Impala, and I could make a good argument that both are indie rock. Lyrically, they stay weirdly consistent. In fact, eerily consistent. But that raises the really important question of, should they? If indie rock was truly the subversive cultural powerhouse it was supposed to be when it set out, you'd think it would continue to subvert expectations, not just subvert the expectations of genres when it first started, meaning the expectations of indie as a genre would change narratively, musically, in all ways. But notably, it's really weird that we could compare an album released this year to the narratives of an album released 30 years ago. And not only are they similar, at times they are exactly the same. Instead, bands that do challenge these expectations are frequently called posers, or quickly grouped in with a different subgenre like grunge, or just outright thrown out of the genre. Genre's consistency leads to greater cultural faults of the genre. In his article, Indie, the Institutional Politics and Aesthetics of a Popular Genre, David Hesmondla explains much of the genre had become associated with a backlash against feminism, in the form of a new men's magazine which celebrated an unreconstructed version of young masculinity, a hegemonic sexual politics which went almost unchallenged. Well, indie rock served to be an alternative to rocker perspectives of the 80s and a unique perspective of social dialogue. The limited scope of the contributors to the genre in race, gender, sexuality, and cultural background caused it to default to the same pitfalls that it originally was supposed to critique. While indie rock remains one of the most influential genres in popular music to this day, it remains greatly undiverse, and despite the efforts of many musicians who have broken into the space outside of traditional scopes, such as Will Toledo of Car Seat Headrest and Phoebe Bridgers of Boy Genius, the genre still perpetuates certain forms of masculine purity and social commentary that appeal most to the people who share demographic similarities to the original progenitors of the genre. Ironically, for most of, if not all of its history, indie has not been independent of the social expectations of the genre or the corporation of the music scene that it originally set itself out to distance from. Instead, it developed a strict set of motifs and tropes that are strictly abided by, over time solidifying itself as a genre that perpetuates the cultural homogeny of the people who created it, and the very system it is supposed to critique. Sonically, the genre has changed and shifted, but it is eerily similar to how much indie rock still reads like its first major hits from the 90s. The genre does aim to defy all expectations, all of them, but in doing so, it's created rules that are actually more restricting than the ideas it's actively attempting to subvert. Not to mention, if it is a countercultural movement, that the ideas still remain focused around a very specific cishet, middle-class, white male perspectives, one that there is a reason why pop musicians and radio stations love. Indie's a marketing gimmick, and it has been since the first major label picked up an indie band 30 years ago. The music isn't bad, and that's the point. The music can be good, but it is poser in a way. At least in the way that somehow being a poser actually plays into the marketing gimmicks of a record label in the first place. It creates an in-group and an out-group. The intellectual and those who just don't get it, because understanding geese requires a very high IQ. While reading and writing this script, I actually went down a bit of a rabbit hole reading and referencing some ideas that are based more in literary and theory and sociology. For that reason, I am going to go on this tangent just for a minute and talk about Fernand de Saussure. He was a structuralist theorist who coined the idea of binary opposition. Basically, it's the idea of having two ideas and two names for those ideas, and inherently in doing so, it creates an in-group and an out-group. According to Jacques Derrida, one of these ideas almost always defines the other, like indie and poser. Structuralism is the idea of approaching things and breaking them down to their component parts, or the simplest way of understanding it. It's not a road that is asphalt with lines painted on it. The paint is made out of XYZ. Structuralism does provide a good framework for understanding why certain things function in certain frameworks, whether that is understanding why certain songs are popular, or understanding why certain types of roads will cause less accidents. But it does have some shortcomings, like completely ignoring the ideas of people and the humanity behind their decisions. The idea directly going after structuralism in literary theory was post-structuralism, which wanted to apply the ideas of structuralism to a more human perspective. Just like how we treated the genre discussion, though, I'm going to approach post-structuralism with quite a lot of brevity, because a video on literary theory would be very long, and I don't think I'm qualified to make it. So, glossing over the differences, Derrida was a post-structuralist who really stressed the idea of what he called deconstruction, which is notably not destroying, but more like unraveling or taking apart the ideas of these binary oppositions, which could create a new understanding of what these things usually mean, usually removing those preconceived notions and biases before reconstructing them. Importantly, this meant deconstruction had to be done without a bias one way or another. It had to be done completely apolitically. It was a critique to society apolitically that was going against every other expectation that was set of him. That sounds very familiar and very similar to indie rock, but post-structuralism similarities to indie aside, creating those opposing groups of indie and poser are ironically making both controlled by a societal expectation of what is artificial and what should be valued by society. The idea of logocentrism is the belief that human language is based on some sort of true definable force, whether that is God, or that everything is inherently true or false, ignoring the gray area between it. Post-structuralists argued that structuralists used logocentrism as one of their defining beliefs. Going back to the road being asphalt, there is a slight problem with saying roads are asphalt, as asphalt can be described as further component parts, which can be described by further component parts, meaning that you're still describing things based off of the belief that there is an inherent component part and not the smallest idea is defined by what your society values as notable, usually being like, I'm going to describe a book as a collection of paper because paper is a finished produced product. In a capitalistic society, you might get my drift. Post-structuralists really pushed against the idea of logocentrism. It's worth noting that structuralists didn't really push for it, but post-structuralists claimed that structuralists were inherently tied up in logocentrism because binary oppositions are seldomly, if ever, divided across the binary evenly. One side almost always had more power. It would mean that the language was actually slanted to make one side sound good culturally, while the other one was lesser by its connection and relation to the other. Indie may have been created as subversive, but making it a good thing, a thing you can be, only if you follow the ideas of the in-group, which is only more problematic when we remind ourselves that the genre in the group are defined by a very small, specific demographic who also continue to dominate culturally across multiple different mediums and continue to have a stranglehold over the music that is considered good in a genre that is supposed to subvert what good is. So you might ask yourself, reasonably, if all you're gonna do is shit on indie rock for over an hour, why would you even make this video? Well, one of the reasons is what we just talked about, deconstruction, the goal of being able to acknowledge the shortcomings of something I genuinely like, redefining it in a way that might minimize them or help improve my perception culturally. If we can acknowledge the biases and define what indie and poser actually are, we could quantify their impact and then inherently limit the power that we allow to be held over us by a ruling class of what those words and identities could mean to us. If we're able to restructure, that's why it's called that! If we're able to restructure what indie rock is socially and find a new way to enjoy the work. But that kind of implies I don't like indie rock. And believe me, I do. I make indie rock. In fact, it's one of the largest parts of my life. And if intellectualism can be bad, why am I diving into this genre for over an hour and using ideas like post-structuralism and queer theory in order to analyze the genre? Well, to be honest, when I started writing this video, in a lot of ways I wasn't aware of these biases. I just started this project when I wrote a paper for a class as a genre study, and I found the current state of the genre that I actively am participating in to be lackluster. I was unhappy with it. I found it very hypocritical. So I continue doing my research on the past paper, and I used the extra info to make this video essay. Because simply put, I wanted to attempt to rephrase my own criticism, not as a negative or a method of tearing down others' work, but a method of recognizing patterns and blind spots in work that I wholeheartedly and genuinely enjoy. Also, there is so much elitism in the scene right now, that it's only growing as certain bands and labels make a push to grow this divide to profit. Intellectualism can be a dividing tool that overempowers certain people in the scene, but honestly, the connection to theory and criticism is a certain draw to the genre for myself and other people. So I guess you could say it's a self-commentary. But also, criticizing and looking at these things through these lenses and doing it yourself takes away that power from other people. Down below, I've linked literally every source that I read while making this video. So if you are interested in doing this yourself and coming to your own conclusion, I encourage you to do so. Everything I've read was open access, and regardless of some of the jargon in there, with Wikipedia, I'm sure you could understand literally every paper below. They're not going to be overly filled with crazy, over-the-top stuff. That's all to say that anti-intellectualism is just as bad as elitism. Sometimes it's even worse, and it's a binary opposition, like we talked about before. So approaching the music just as music, and with the critical approach, we've recognized the patterns, we can actually apply it to find the music acknowledges these biases, or even subverts them within indie stylings or outside the genre, and we can make sure that these voices that would otherwise be ignored are actually amplified.
Editor Nick here. I just wanted to pop in real quick to say that I don't think I realized, even while I was recording this, how much effort and time would go into not only writing and recording, but also editing and doing all the behind the scenes stuff. So if you do enjoy this video, interacting with it in any way helps a lot because more people will see it, and I'll know that this is content that people actually enjoy and it's worth putting my time into. But now, back to your video.
There has to be at least one person yelling at the screen in this moment because I'm only focusing on men, and right now there are some really popular and really awesome women absolutely killing it in the indie genre. A few of these bands that I can think of are going to be Big Thief and Boy Genius. Notably, these aren't only female-fronted bands, but these are bands that primarily focus on women-driven narratives and even will frame female sexuality as one of their ideas. Not masculine and not pure. Car Seat Headrest is probably one of my favorite queer indie bands. Of course, him being a furry also adds to the queerness of his work. He's literally going to be defying the expectations of indie as a genre, which ironically has made people say, well, it's not indie rock, it's this, or this. But in reality, this, to me, makes it feel much more indie than other options. They put out an album somewhat recently called The Scholars, and I'd recommend it. It's also worth noting that he put out 12 albums in 8 years, and it's a really interesting depiction of a queer person who is being very, very queer in talking about being a young person in the 2010s. For example, the line, "We were all on Skype, and I laughed and I changed the subject," when talking about his coming out story as something that he did over the internet. This really frames indie in a really interesting light, in my opinion, as we start to see indie shift from being this idea of broad, heteronormative, typical, classic storytelling to something that's happening and has to happen in the 21st century. Now it has to happen before a certain time because Skype isn't a thing anymore. I found that out recently. All my Skype messages gone. I don't think there was anything good on Skype. One time I got doxxed because of Skype, because Skype didn't have encryption on your IP. What a time we lived in. Regardless, Toledo is an absolute perfect reference of indie rock. His lyrics are super self-reflexive. He absolutely still is going to push that male purity idea, but notably, he's still a gay man who's pushing a very interesting idea and definitely a voice you really don't see that frequently in indie rock. You might be familiar with Pansy Division 2. They're an even earlier example of queer people within indie. They're absolutely trailblazers with indie expression, with queer. They're absolutely trailblazers of queer expression within indie spaces. And I think it's sad that over the years they've kind of taken a backseat. And finally, I wanted to find a couple of really good indie bands that were fronted by, or preferably completely comprised of people of color. But you'd be surprised at how unbelievably difficult this is. While there are more queer people and there are more women in the scene, there continues to be a very, very white focus on popular indie music. So trying to find bands that were comprised of people of color was quite difficult. But I did get a couple that I'm quite fond of. If I just had to choose two bands that I already knew going into this video and I would recommend as two bands of black artists who are absolutely killing it in the indie scene, I'd have to think of a classic TV on the radio and a band that's really up and coming, or really they're just exploding in the scene, being Paradox, who have some absolutely awesome songs and they're just doing some awesome stuff, really kind of going crazy with their festival circuit right now. So to end this, I really wanted to go to a critical reflection, as I've had to do with a lot of my classes in the past. With a critical reflection, we have to ask three questions. What, so what, and what now? What? Indie rock. That's what. Indie rock is a musical genre that started by heterosexual white men out of the post-punk movement in the 80s. It has grown over time to be seen as a sort of outcast, sometimes with a K. I did it a third time. Perfect trifecta, three-pointer, Kobe, etc. Over time, it's become more focused on the outcast, and this intellectual focus on it is more of a show of what is considered important culturally rather than what is actually in the genre itself. So what? Well, that means that the genre has a lot of shortcomings. Over time, it's actually become sort of less inclusive to queer people. We've seen a absolute change in the sound, but almost no change in the lyrical content. And notably, we've seen almost no change in the people who are accepted as indie rock creators or contributors. So what now? Now I'm going to go listen to TV on the radio and Paradox, and hopefully you have some more recommendations for absolutely awesome indie rock bands filled with queer people, women, and people of color, because there aren't that many that I know of, and I'm sure there's a lot of them out there because it's a big genre, and I like it a lot. So my name's Nick. My band West Egg Social is putting out an EP on May 26th. We are two queer people out of Colorado, and I think we make some pretty good music. So if you want to check it out, we got some more stuff linked down below. I have some other videos, and we got lots planned in the future. So have a good day. Bye.
I don't wanna go.